Welcome to the Martin Bailey Photography Podcast. It's January 26, 2020, and this is episode 694. Today, we continue our Travelogue series covering my recent Hokkaido winter landscape photography adventure. I'd like to start by answering a question to last week's podcast from Paulo Silva. Thanks for the great questions, Paulo. Although I've answered in the comments for last week's post, I'm going to include my answers here too, as this is probably useful for others as well. So Paulo's questions were: why do you use apertures so small as f/16 with such wide focal lengths as 22mm? For the longer focal lengths, I understand if you want to keep everything in focus, but as wide as 22 or 35mm, wouldn't you get the lens's best performance keeping everything in focus by using a little wider aperture, say f8 to f11? Having in mind that diffraction usually starts to show with f11 and smaller. I know that this depends on the lens that you're using, and my experience is only with APS-C sensors in which diffraction happens sooner than with full-frame sensors. Another question, if I may, Paulo writes, is where did you put the focal plane? At the trees, or did you use some kind of hyperfocal distance? Okay, so my settings are usually the results of thinking through what I want to do with the elements of the image, and also based on testing my gear to understand what it's capable of. There is also a hint of this in last week's post with regards to those particular scenes. Here in the blog post for this week, I'll embed a gallery of the 10 images from last week. And you can see all of this at mbp.ac/694. The main reason for those images in particular is because I wanted to get the shutter speed between a 20th and a 40th of a second to cause the snow to streak slightly. It's hard to see in the web versions, but it makes a beautiful pattern over the trees at these shutter speeds. If that requires me to stop down to f/16, I'm fine with that, because I test my lenses as described in episode 594 to see where diffraction starts to kick in. I built the functionality into my Photographer's Friend app to also display diffraction warnings when calculating depth of field, which I also reference, but I've found that my gear does not start to visibly show the effect of diffraction until I stop down to f/22, but the depth of field does increase. For example, the hut and tree shot with the dark sky was shot at 91mm, and at f/16 the close foreground snow is starting to come out of the depth of field. For the snow pillows shot, I was trying to get a slow shutter speed to record the water movement. For the dawn mist in BA shot, you'll see that I did open up the aperture to f11 because firstly I was hand holding, but also because the foreground snow was not going to be so important, so I didn't need to stop down so much. For the blue waterfall, I opened up to f11 and adjusted my ISO to get a 1 second shutter speed, again to make sure that the water looked the way it does. For the ravens in the tree shot, I opened up to f11 to get a shutter speed of 100th of a second, but I didn't want to go any faster because I wanted the flying birds to blur slightly when flying. I have to admit that these are perhaps better examples of my thought process because of the low light causing me to decide where the trade-offs will be played out. With brighter scenes, I generally just shoot pretty much everything at f/14, but this is more out of habit. Before I really tested my lenses, I used f/14 as my soft ceiling, An f/16 was pretty much the highest I would go, but that's no longer the case. I'm aware that some people like to shoot at f/8, mostly because they've read somewhere that this is the sweet spot for the lens. But this, in my experience, is generally completely unnecessary and often causes them to have to focus stack, etc. I rarely focus stack, and I mean like almost never, and the thought of having to do that to overcome an obstacle that does not exist turns me completely cold. Before anyone makes a decision like that, they need to test their lenses and find out where diffraction starts to become visible for all of their lenses. Also, as you said, Paolo, crop factor cameras will start to see diffraction at wider apertures, so you do need to test. But my app also shows the warnings accordingly when crop factor sensor sizes are selected. In case you haven't seen it, I'll put a link to Photographer's Friend in the post. People also, in my experience, have a very poor understanding of depth of field, and very few people understand that depth of field is directly affected by the megapixels or resolution of the sensor in the camera. You get shallower depth of field with higher resolution cameras if, as I do, you check critical focus at 100%. This is what I enabled with the Pixel Peeper mode that I built into my Photographer's Friend app. When enabled, you can clearly see the difference in depth of field as the sensor resolution increases. Regarding Paolo's other question about where I focus, most of the time I am focusing on the main subject to give it the clearest pixels. I occasionally focus around a third into the screen when I need more depth of field, but I generally feel that the main subject is best. With the shadow of the tree shot, for example, I recall focusing on the middle of the snow, as that was about 1/3 into the frame, but also because the shadow was the main subject of this image, not the tree itself. This also helped me to get more focus on the foreground snow. Okay, so let's continue to discuss the next 10 images from this trip. After leaving BA, we headed over to the coast, which is a relatively long drive. So after our morning shoots before we leave, the next opportunity is the Shinto Torii Gate that you can see in this next image. I had been excited about the fact that it was going to be a high tide on both evenings that we'd be visiting this torii, but as you can see from the sky, it was a relatively clear day, and I've found over the years that a clear sky, which indicates high atmospheric pressure, has more effect on the sea than the tides at this particular location. If it was overcast, meaning low pressure, the sea would have been up over the concrete base and the sky much more interesting. Some members of the group got some really nice shots with the sunset reflecting in the pools between the rocks in front of the gate, which was great. We'd come back here the following evening, but once again, despite it being high tide, there was a clear sky, so it didn't really work again. We also spend a lot of time at some other locations in this area while we're there, and one of them you can see in this next image. I like this spot because there are tetrapods lined up along the shore, often covered in ice like this, and then there's a line of tetrapods out in the sea which add an extra element of interest to break up the otherwise somewhat monotonous sea. One thing that came up as we shot here is how I focus to get both the foreground icy tetrapods and the distant tetrapods shot. And this is also related to Paolo's earlier question, so I'll explain. Now that I'm using the EOS R with the electronic viewfinder, I can do this directly in the viewfinder. But in the past I would do the same thing with live view. Basically, I zoom in on one of the extremes in the focus on live view or in the viewfinder. Either the foreground or distant objects will work. Then, having set my aperture to something hopefully small enough to get both subjects in focus, I hold down the depth of field preview button, which I have mapped to the exposure lock or asterisk button on the back of my EOS R. Then, say if I'm looking at the near subject, I physically move the focus out with the focus ring until I see the near subject start to go soft, then pull back a little again, so that it's still in the near end of the depth of field. Then I zoom in on the distant subject and check that it's also in focus. Sometimes I have to pull the focus back a little to check that it does go out of focus when I do, as it's easier to see when it comes back into focus. There is also focus peaking indication in my EOS R, which helps, as everything that is highlighted has a sharp in-focus edge. You can see how little snow we had this year in this next image. Normally this beach has around 50 centimeters of snow and it's difficult to walk on, but this year we were able to walk around quite freely. Rather than fighting it, I used the sparse snow as part of the composition for this shot, using it as leading lines towards the outcrop of land and tip of the triangular tetrapods. Just in case, we swung by the Torii Shinto Gate one last time on the way out of town before we left this area on the last day, but with the lower tide and clear sky, the water was so far back that I found out for the first time that there's a second concrete base under the one that you can see in the earlier photo, which was also visible. So I had the group stay on the bus and we started our journey to the next location, shooting some of my favourite spots along the way, the first of which you can see in this next image. I shot this with my medium format camera, the Rolleiflex, and I'm pleased that I did because my EOS R had mysteriously switched to 12 megapixel mode without any warning, the frame after the previous image of the beach. I noticed it around 50 frames later and have no idea why it switched. This happens when you put an EFS or a crop factor lens on the EOS R, but looking at when it switched, I had not even taken the lens off the camera, and I don't own an EFS lens, so nothing should have caused this to happen. I tell you, in general, I'm very happy with my Canon gear, and I love the EOS R, but when I found out this had happened, I felt like throwing my camera into the sea. Luckily, the Rollie came to the rescue, and I still have some high-resolution images from this part of the trip. I really like how we have 3 distinctly different types of tetrapods at this location. The practice golf balls in the foreground, the angular tetrapods in the middle, and then the rounder-legged tetrapods out in the sea. The word tetrapod actually means 4-legged and is a trademark of the original company that made them, but I just call all of these wave breakers tetrapods. We swung by the boat graveyard that I also love to shoot on the way to the next location, but again the lack of snow didn't make it look very pretty. Luckily, we had some snow while we were there, so we were able to get some nice shots the following day. On the first day in this area, we continued on to the Noshapu fishing port and photographed the boats there, and as we got settled into our shooting, the snow started, giving us a nice clean white foreground in the most part. This is another shot from my Rolleiflex that I was quite happy with. I actually had a few problems developing my film from this trip, as I tried different developing chemicals based on a recommendation from a previous post about developing my own film. The original chemical that I was using, Ilford DDX, was giving me great results every time. But I found that I needed to tweak the Adux Rodinol development process quite a lot before I could get the results that I was happy with from the lab box that I shared with you in episode 682. The main problem was that I started out diluting it at 25:1, as that gives faster development times, and I was also agitating every 30 seconds based on advice from the lab box folks. But it turns out that both of these things result in very grainy negatives when working with Rodinol. I started diluting at 50:1 for almost double the development time, and also reduced the agitation to 10 seconds every minute, and also not turning the handle on the lab box as fast, and I've found that this gives me much better results. Here's another shot from the Noshapu port, this time shot with my EOS R. I'm really pleased that I'm able to get very similar looking images from both cameras in many cases. Obviously, when I'm converting my EOS R images to black and white, that is. I found myself looking at my focal length quite regularly as we shot, and whenever I was around 50mm, I reached for the rollie to get a film shot, as it's a 75mm lens, which is about 50mm in 35mm sensor terms. It snowed some overnight, so the next morning we revisited the boat graveyard for much better looking scenes than the previous day. We also had a great sky at times, with the low sun illuminating the clouds from the side, adding some nice texture, enhanced a little in Capture One Pro mind. I feel somewhat privileged to watch these boats slowly decay over the years, and this year was no exception. More of the cabins seem to have collapsed, and more bits are falling off as these boats succumb to the elements. This next photo is of a secondary boat graveyard further into the port than the first, and was pretty nice this year because of the lack of snow. There's a rugged feel to this shot that I find appealing, helped once again by the sky detail that I pulled out using Capture One Pro. There's a little more grass and dirt showing through than I'd like, but I think this just adds to the overall grungy feel, so I'm pretty happy with the results of our visit. I'm generally a glass half full sort of person, so rather than concentrating on what we lost through the lack of snow, I really enjoyed getting into the stuff that we gained. The next image is usually out of bounds because the snow is too deep to get into this part of the port, but that wasn't the case this year. I believe these boats are still seaworthy and in use, so it isn't a graveyard as such, but I still like the overall rugged feel and mood of these shots, and all in all, I was very happy with what we got this year. In the afternoon we swung by the fish drying frames, and once again I shot them with my Rolleiflex as well as my EOS R. I like both shots, but I think the square format suits this shot, so I'll go with the Rollie version. We were lucky again here, as we'd been told as we spoke with the people that own these frames a few days earlier, that there was no snow on the ground. There were only a few centimetres of snow when we got there, but that was enough to clean up the scene like this, so once again we were very fortunate. We'll finish there for this episode, as we've reached our 10 photos. I have not had time to create an extra episode for next week, and I'm leaving for the first of this year's 2 Japan winter wildlife trips tonight, so we'll be skipping next week. But I will be back in 2 weeks' time to conclude this Travelogue series and start to update you on the wildlife tours. If you might be interested in joining the landscape tour in 2021 or future years, check out the tour page at mbp.ac/HLPA. Thanks very much for listening today. If you enjoy this podcast, please share a link with your friends. Subscribe in iTunes or your favourite podcast program to ensure uninterrupted delivery. If you have a moment to rate the podcast or leave us a review in iTunes, that helps to keep us relevant in the huge number of podcasts out there now. You can find me on Instagram, Facebook, Twitter and LinkedIn, and links to everything that I'm up to are at martinbaileyphotography.com, so do drop by and take a look. I'll be back in 2 weeks' time with another episode. In the meantime, you take care and have a great week, whatever you're doing. Bye bye.